very much. Are we on? Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Sorry.
Yeah. Lovely. I always worry these things after Gordon Brown. Everyone who came backstage to talk to us just immediately like that, just in case I made some awful comment. Well, thank you very much for being so lovely in the first half. We move on now to such an exciting thing to be able to introduce. I don't think there are many comedians who can say the next month they're gigging with George Galloway and Nigel Farage. It's an honour for me to be able to say so. I should just say before I bring George on that he and I got to know each other. I'm still at talkSPORT. George used to do the show before mine at talkSPORT as well, so we got to know each other when we would hand over on air. And even though ideologically we have our differences, even though I would say I'm still just about on the left, I got to know George very well, and he's an absolute legend. I think he's the finest orator in British politics at the moment. He's certainly one of the most controversial MPs. I can't thank him enough, really, for coming down here and doing this opening night. Hopefully, we will see flashes of the great genius. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage my guest, Mr. George Galloway. Do you want to put your hat? Lovely. George, I was thinking about my own sort of lifespan in politics, and I've been politically active, as I say, for 16 years. This year will mark your 10th anniversary of being expelled from the Labour Party. Yeah. Do you feel that you're isolated on the left now? And if so, are you comfortable with it?
No, I'd rather have not been expelled from the Labour Party. It's amazing you say that, because just this very day I had a conversation with a very senior member of the Labour Party in Parliament. It was on lobby terms, I can't say whom. But that person did not know I had actually been expelled. He thought that I had left, and he asked me, what were the reasons for you leaving again? And that's what that told me, was that how young
Ed Miliband is.
No, it wasn't Ed Miliband, but it was somebody very important. How young they are, and how short political memory is. Whereas I'm blessed or cursed, depending on your point of view, with an elephantine memory. I remember what Trotsky said to Lenin on the 21st of October in Petrograd, never mind what happened 10 years ago.
He said, why did you get kicked out of the party?
Well, Mr. Blair expelled me for comparing him to a wolf and then apologising to the noble wolf. But we'll come on to that, I'm sure. So, no, I'd rather not have been expelled. I spent 36 years in the Labour Party. Like you, I joined it at 13, exactly the same age. You know, I loved it a lot more than the people who kicked me out of it. I loved its vocabulary, its iconography, its old-fashioned ritual, and so on. It was really something important to me in my life.
If the Labour Party said, George, we'd have you back, would you go back?
No, not unless Labour became Labour again. And I'm sorry to say, I don't see any prospect of that.
But you were kicked out in 2003, so for nearly 9 years you've been an MP under New Labour.
Yeah.
And 6 of those years New Labour in office. So even under Blair you were still comfortable just about staying in the Labour fold.
Just about, yeah, but I was permanently rebelling in votes and so on, and breaking 3-line whips, and it was kind of only a matter of time. And I told them so at the time when Mr. Blair won the election on the death of John Smith, who was a very close friend of mine and who I believe is the best Labour Prime Minister we never had. When John Smith died and Blair got the leadership, I told people then, and I told them in front of Mr. Blair on a platform at Inverness, into a microphone live on television, that this man might look nice, and I recognise from your earlier part of the gig that he looked very nice to you. This is going to end in disaster. This is a hijack of the Labour Party, and they're going to fly the Labour Party to destruction. And I think that's more or less what happened.
But George, see, I count myself as just about on the left, because in terms of social conscience and social liberalism and things like that, and workers' rights. But if the Labour Party continued to be on the left as it was, would it ever have won a general election again?
Well, there's 2 points I think need to be made. Of course, that's a question that's asked all the time. First of all, most people in the country today, by all indicators, public opinion polls, phone-ins to shows like ours, letters to newspapers, anecdotal evidence, most people share most of the views that I have been arguing for and that Mr. Blair slaughtered as being, untenable electorally. Most people think the Iraq war was a disaster. Most people think we ought to be out of Afghanistan tomorrow evening, if not yesterday. Most people think bankers should be strung up from Southwark Bridge, and that they're
Millennium Bridge would be nice. It's closer to the city.
Yes, right. And that their ill-gotten gains should be taken back off them in tax. I noticed you distanced yourself from that policy earlier. Most people think that...
I believe in ambition, George, that's all.
Well, we'll come to that. That most people believe that privatisation went too far. Most people believe that these PPIs, PPPs, all this public-private partnerships and private finance initiatives and so on were an accountancy trick which has deceived and robbed the public, and so on. I could go through almost all subjects, with the possible exception of capital punishment and maybe Europe. And most people are on the left. So I think your thesis falls on that count. But I would say this is the more controversial point. What is the point in trying to get into government if in government you have to govern like the last lot that you replaced? What is the point of that? I've never understood it. I would not want to be in power if I could not do with power that which I think needs to be done. If I had to be like you in order to get into power, well, why not just let you be in power?
But there are subtle changes, aren't there? So you accept the changing times. So just as the Labour Party moved on things like economy and crime, so the Tory Party of today has had to move on things like the NHS. And the Tory Party went into the last election defending the NHS. People can argue about the reforms they brought in since, but nevertheless, the NHS under Cameron won't be fully dismantled.
No, but it's on the way to dismantlement, and it's in a shocking state, as anyone who has had recent engagement with it, I think, would testify. And moreover, they performed a deception on the public, because they said there would be no top-down reorganisation of the NHS, and as soon as they got in, they introduced top-down reorganisation of the NHS, and it's causing chaos, as anybody who works in it knows. Now, I take your point about crime. You see, this is where I lose whatever support I've got in here. I'm not a liberal. I used to say on talkSPORT, people would say that's a funny view for a liberal. I used to say, I mean small L, I used to say, never confuse me with a liberal. I'm not a liberal. Labour should have been much tougher on crime, always, than they were. And there was a period in social democracy when often the Social Democrats sounded like they were on the side of the criminal and cared little about the victim of the crime. So, I'm not a liberal, and I don't think that Labour ought to have been a liberal party. I'm a socialist. That means I believe in order, I believe in discipline, I believe in organisation, I believe in leadership. I think that the nation has to be united and stay together, and that way we'll march forward.
But when you look at socialist governments in recent years, and when you think about Russia, when you think about East Germany, the fall of the Berlin Wall, what was also twinned with these socialist states was also horrific human rights abuse. When people saw the choice between socialism and capitalism, why did the people who socialism was meant to be set up for choose capitalism so emphatically?
Well, I mean, I'm not flying a flag for that brand of socialism, though you're fully entitled to indict me for it, as you're going to do anyway. But it's worth making the point that in every one of these former socialist countries, the Communist Party remains a massive force in politics. I mean, in Russia, for example, Putin is the leader, and the number 2 party is the Communist Party. And that's true in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Romania, and so on. So it's not true that the socialist ideas are universally reviled in countries that once had socialism. And East Germany actually was the most successful of these socialist economies, probably because they were German rather than because they were socialist. But that's another matter. So there were many good things achieved. in those socialist countries, not the least of which is this. If it were not for the Soviet Union, we would be conducting this conversation in German. Because if not for the Soviet Union, Hitler would have won the war, and we would now be a Nazi-occupied country, or perhaps we would have overthrown their yoke by now. But older people here, I noticed nobody acknowledged that. Older people, our grandfathers and their fathers, would be able to tell you very clearly that it was the sacrifice of the people of the Soviet Union, it was the incredible feats of the Red Army that actually defeated Adolf Hitler. Our role in the war, after our crucial role of being the last man standing and refusing to surrender, which is, I think, to our eternal credit, it was our finest hour, as Churchill put it, but our role kind of was marginal thereafter. So, there were many achievements in the socialist times in these socialist countries, but there were many disastrous failures. Now, you want to talk about horrific human rights abuses? No doubt there were human rights abuses, and no doubt many of them were horrific. But as a man who's ambivalent about the use of torture, you ought to be careful where you go on that. Look, capitalism has killed more people than Adolf Hitler. Capitalism kills people every few minutes that we've been speaking.
What do you mean by that, George? Do you mean in actual wars waged by capitalist governments, or
no
just the
wars.
capitalist system draws?
No wars, the system itself. And I gave an example at a private school I was speaking at the other day, 2 days ago in Brentwood in Essex, Jack Straw's alma mater. I made this point to someone who raised querulously, as you just have. What do you mean by that? I said this. Let's take just one example. Malaria kills 50 million people a year. Malaria could be cured with a single jab. A rational, planned economic system would say, turn the factory on, run as much malaria medicine as is needed to inoculate the world against malaria, and malaria is finished. But capitalism says, we'll run as much malaria medicine as you've got the money to pay for. And if you don't have the money to pay for it, then you'll just have to risk dying of malaria. So I say the economic system that we have, that prevails in most of the world, though not entirely all of it, is one that cares little for human life and cares mostly about filthy lucre.
But you could also say, you could look at communist countries and socialist countries as well and say, well, people had no money, people used to die of starvation in places like Russia, and malnutrition.
Well, let's take a more contemporary example, China. China has lifted more people out of poverty in the last 30 years than any system, any regime ever has. Now, number one, there is a price in human rights, and number two, it's not entirely socialist. But it has still a socialist base to its economy. The state has a decisive role in the economy. There were 21 billionaires in China 2 years ago, and 11 of them are now in prison. China deals rather harshly with the kind of people we give knighthoods to and send to prison. And there's an example of illiberalism of which I approve. There's no doubt that capitalism is, I believe, literally a murderous system. It cannot be as good as it gets. There must be a better way. And I think that socialism is that better way.
So let's go back to sort of your childhood and growing up. You joined the Labour Party at 13. What was it that inspired you to get into politics?
Well, I was born into a Labour household. My father was a lay official of the engineering union, AEU. He worked in a factory making cash registers. He was a trade union man through and through, and therefore he was in the Labour Party. My mother, from Irish immigrant Republican background, was first and foremost against imperialism. When I was young, I came home and told my Irish grandfather that the teacher had said that Britain had an empire so vast that upon it the sun never set. And my grandfather answered, that's because God would never trust the British in the dark. So that's the kind of family background that I came from. And I grew up in a house full of books, and we were banned from watching ITV, which was quite a new thing at the time, ITV, because my parents said it's rubbish on ITV. I think they were not that far wrong. We were forced to watch only the BBC, and when BBC Two came on, came online, on stream rather. We had to watch only BBC Two. It was that kind of house. But you know, I owe my parents a very great deal. My mother's still alive, but I particularly owe my father for my political life that I've been able to lead. May God rest his soul.
So you haven't drifted right in old age at all?
No,
I think that goes without
and
saying.
I'm a bit worried about that because you've drifted right since the last time I saw you, and that was only 2 weeks past Wednesday. So I'm a bit worried that I actually believe exactly the same things that I always believe. That's not to say I haven't made mistakes. I've made many. It's not to say that I cannot now see mistakes in the political system and ideas that I have. I can. But I still believe in them. I should say, talking of trumpets and blowing them, if you're not following Matt on the radio and in his stand-up career, you really should. He's a very, very smart guy and he's a big star in the future. Really a big star in the future. I won't say I discovered him on talkSPORT, but there were times on talkSPORT where I was his only supporter.
My only listener, I think, most of the time.
Especially around that 3-4 o'clock in the morning mark, where people have got their tools in their hands. I'm sure he said towel.
I mean, you've spoken to a lot of these people as well, though. I mean, we'll come on to the sort of talk radio days. I mean, I genuinely felt when you were at talkSPORT that you were the best radio presenter in the country because there was nowhere else.
Thank you very much. I wish I was still there. It was a great, great gig. 7 years I did that.
It was incredible, and it was proper for a station that does a lot of sports coverage, obviously hence the name, to then in the evening to be able to listen to this absolute rumble every night, and you've taken a, you know, and even though I disagree with you on things, George, you know, it's always great to hear people air their opinions and to hear people change their opinions and to have the ignorant as the people that you would often, frankly, tear to shreds a lot of the time. And it was. Nice. I know you're against blood sport, but you walked the line with the way that you took some of those people. It was absolutely incredible. And that style you have, which I'll come on to the Hitchens debates in a second, but certainly in the way that the Respect Party. In fact, I came to a public meeting. I've never told you this before. You set up the Respect Party. I'd not long joined Labour, and Respect was sort of being talked about, and you addressed a group of socialists in Nottingham in this hotel room, and it was...
in the George Hotel?
In the George Hotel, it was, yeah. And what was most incredible about it was I disagreed with so much of what you said, but my spine still tingled because of the nature of your oratory. You know, it was the first lesson in how I could find someone that I disagreed with on a lot of the things, because a lot of it was about Iraq at the time, still so incredible and so entertaining, and you've carried that forward in Respect, but with the way that the Respect Party is... I mean, I've campaigned against Respect in the past in Leicester in 2004. A lot of people have issues with the way that the party campaigns, and a lot of people think that maybe it's too aggressive. I mean, do you think the Respect Party is too aggressive? Do you think it is a little too aggressive, or is this just the rough and tumble of politics?
I think it is, and it's because we're outside what Dr. Johnson said, the grimmest dictatorship of them all is the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy. We are outside of the prevailing orthodoxy, and the others are in it. Tweedledee, Tweedledum, Tweedledee and a half. If an arse could have 3 cheeks, it would be the 3 mainstream parties. And we're outside of that. And when you see an arse with 3 cheeks, you've just got to slap it. It's irresistible. And that, you know, it's because we don't believe, you see, that there's only an inch in politics between, you know, within which the choices must be made. We have a different paradigm. We believe something almost entirely different. So you can't really conduct that discourse in over to you and yes, over to you, because that's what the House of Commons is like, and that's what I think, at least today, not when I first joined it. And I think people don't like that. People instinctively know that when, you know, David Cameron gets up and mournfully incants that he'll never forget the name of the soldier he's about to pay tribute to, who's just lost his life, and Ed Miliband gets up and says exactly the same thing, people know that by the end of Prime Minister's questions, 30 minutes later, neither of them could name the soldier they'd just promised never to forget. People know that. And people think that these mainstream politicians are insincere Mr. Blair might well have coined the phrase that actually Bob Monkhouse did, that once you've learned to fake the sincerity, the rest is easy. And that's what I think most people think of politicians. And because we're different to that, whether you agree with us or not, like us or not, people know that we are different to that. And I think that's why we've got some traction.
But there's a difference between maybe saying things that a lot of people don't agree with and maybe perhaps the sort of conduct of the party and the tactics that are used. Now, I understand that if you're outside of the mainstream, you don't have the same machinery that parties can rattle into by-elections and that you have to be. I've got nothing wrong with a political street fight, and that's why I like working on by-elections. But some people would say that if you look at Leicester, if you look at Bradford, if you look at the places where Respect campaigns, it's usually in areas of a high ethnic mix where there are racial and religious tensions. I mean, do you think in recent years Respect has been guilty of preying upon those tensions for electoral gain?
No, in fact, the same candidate in Leicester, Yvonne Ridley, did really very well just a couple of weeks ago in Rotherham, which is a 95% white town. So I think the thesis falls down at that very point. Yvonne beat the Tories and the Liberals in a 95% white town. Only less than 5% of the people there are Asian and Muslim. And she beat the Tories and the Liberals out the park, actually. And in Leicester, I didn't realise that you'd been working in that by-election, she secured then the best fourth-party election result since the war, until Bradford, which was, of course, of a different order, arithmetically, cephalogically, and for me.
It was an incredible... I don't think anyone, maybe apart from you, thought until the day that you were going to win. I mean, did you get any sense throughout that campaign that you were going to win?
Well, I have to... I'm being honest with you, and I know that it will sound far-fetched. I always believed that I would win the Bradford West by-election, but I acknowledge I was the only person, including my friends and family who are with me here tonight. I was literally the only person who thought I'd win it. When I arrived in Bradford on day one of a 20-day campaign, the odds were 200 to 1 against me. Now, I don't believe in gambling, but if I had gambled, my goodness, how rich I would have been, because I believed that I would win it from the very first day. And a friend of mine, Seamus Milne from The Guardian, called me on the Monday of the week of polling, so 3 days before polling day, and he said, I hear that you're going to get a good second. And I said, Seamus, I'm going to win. He said, no. But I was certain on the Monday. And then I tweeted at exactly 10 p.m. the moment the last vote was cast, before the votes were even taken to the counting house, never mind counted. I tweeted the following words: we have won a landslide victory in the Bradford West by-election. And the TV commentators, when I arrived at the count, were so aggressive. How could you send out this claim? The votes haven't even been counted yet. I said, well, speak to me again after they have been. I was absolutely certain that we'd win. Now, partly because I think we fought a fantastic campaign, but mainly because where there is an alternative to the Tweedledee, Tweedledum politics, people will go for it. It's why Farage, I mean, I don't like him as much as you evidently do, and I certainly dislike vehemently his central political message, this Little Englander type mentality. But the reason he's quite popular in the country is for the reasons you say, because he's got an edge, people think he's sincere, and especially if you catch him before 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Allegedly.
I'm sure in Bradford there was still a lot of... Labour, I'm sure, was still being punished for Afghanistan and for Iraq, and obviously a lot of people here tonight know where you stand on Iraq, and I fully understand where you stand, and I know that you know the issues more than probably anyone else, but one of the most, I think it's fair to say, embarrassing things for you was the video footage of you meeting Saddam Hussein. And as we know from your appearance in the Senate committee, you met him twice, not many times, but those 2 meetings, and particularly the one that was on video, do you regret meeting him now?
No. Unlike Donald Rumsfeld, I was not meeting him to sell him guns and gas and give him maps the better to target them. I was meeting him to try and bring about an end to sanctions that were killing an Iraqi child every 6 minutes of every day and night, and to avert a war which has cost the lives of a million people. And jaw is better than war. If we did more jaw-jawing, we would avoid a lot of warring, and the warring is really getting me down, and it's getting the country down. And you see how swiftly now the empire strikes back. We invaded Mali with France on Saturday, and tonight a number of our citizens have been taken hostage and captive in North Africa, in the Maghreb, and God knows what will happen to them. The empire strikes back. It's not a cheap option. If you attack somebody, they attack you back. And I sought to avoid that. And you are now the last person in England who believes that a war which cost 1 million lives, which radicalized Muslims, fanaticized them, extremized them all over the world, was a good idea.
I think the problem is with jaw is that we'd had it from prior to the first Gulf War and in between the two Gulf Wars, and it just got to a point with Saddam Hussein. He'd been aggressive towards Iran, towards the Kuwaitis, towards his own people. What then does... I support the war for left-wing reasons, and I still do, because I think at some point democracy has to stand up to people like Osama bin Laden, like Ahmadinejad, and like Saddam Hussein. And at some point we have to, for humanitarian reasons, like we did in Kosovo, like we did in Sierra Leone, stand up to these people. And it gets to a point where you think, well, what is the point in living in a developed society and sharing these liberal values if we don't stand up for them sometimes?
Yeah. But beware, they might stand up to you. And they might not just stand up to you where you've sent your soldiers to them. They might come here and stand up to you here. And you have to ask the question, are we ready to face that? You have no sons, I do. I'm not ready to send my son to Afghanistan to give his life's blood to defend President Karzai and what you call democracy. I don't call it that in Afghanistan. So if I'm not prepared to send my own son to do that, why should I send other people's sons to do that? And there are a number of really major problems with what you said there. First of all, you conflated all these crimes of Saddam Hussein without mentioning that most of them were committed with our assistance, our behest, and using weapons we gave him to do it with. You said he was aggressive towards Iran. You're right. That's why I was on the side of Iran in the war between 1980 and 1988. But Britain and America were on the side of Iraq. Yeah, but George, they encouraged Saddam Hussein to attack Iran. So you can't really justify pulverizing 1 million Iraqis to punish them for a crime that you encouraged them to commit and armed them to commit in the first place.
I wasn't in government, and I disagree with the arms trade. So I disagreed with the arms of Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean you. I meant Britain as a state.
I understand what you mean.
Britain as a state, America as a state, did pray and aid his aggressive behaviour towards this and that, and some of which you adumbrated there.
What about the people who died in those years in between? What were we doing for those people? Because you were against sanctions, you were against war. In all honesty, what on earth could we have done to persuade Saddam Hussein to leave office?
Well, why is it your business whether Saddam Hussein leaves office or not?
Because I care about suffering around the world, because I'm still a man of the left.
Who gave you the right to choose the leaders of countries thousands of miles away? It's up to Iraq who its leader is.
But it wasn't up to Iraq, so they weren't allowed to vote.
Well, but then they must rise up and overthrow their dictator, as Arabs are now doing in sundry dictatorships. Nobody appointed us, Matt, let alone God gave us a duty or a right to go around the world saying, I'm going to remove your government and your government, especially when it's deeply hypocritical. Because our best friend in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia, which is the darkest tyranny on the earth. So how can they be our best friends? Our best friends, we give them guns and all kinds of support. We help keep the tyranny in power, but we're asked to believe that we're killing somebody next door in defense of democracy and liberty. Nobody believes that, Matt.
No, I don't defend everything that the British and American governments do. I abhor the arms trade, and I think we need a more consistent approach in our foreign policy. But equally, I think where tyranny exists, I care about humanitarianism and freeing people from tyranny. And I just think the problem is when you look at things like conflicts with Iraq, is that the cost of inaction is never given the same emotional weight. So you can sit here and rightly say that the cost of action was that it cost 1 million Iraqi lives. Well, I could easily say that the cost of inaction cost possibly many more, and they're still discovering mass graves in Baghdad.
Human Rights Watch have, and thereby very far from being a pro-Saddamist organisation, estimated that around 40 deaths for political reasons. 40 political deaths occurred in Iraq in the 12 months before the war. So there was a lot of crimes committed by Saddam Hussein, but they were not remotely of the order of the crimes committed by your mate, Tony Blair. Have you any idea what 1 million dead Iraqis would look like? Can you imagine it in Trafalgar Square? You know what a million, you know how big a tower 1 million dead people is? And you want to talk to me about the price and the cost? Well, I supported the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and I think you were right to. I supported it long before Britain and America as states did so. I regularly demonstrated outside the Iraqi embassy. I was the only MP to turn up for the demonstration about Halabja, the gassing of Kurdish people by Saddam Hussein, at a time when the British and American governments continued to claim that Iran had carried out this crime rather than Saddam. It's great for individuals and people and organizations to support other organizations in other people's countries to help them overthrow their tyranny and get things better. That's a different thing from your state invading another state and killing large numbers of people in order to bring about a political outcome which is a reversal of the political outcome they previously willed. Most people in here will not know that Saddam Hussein only became the leader of Iraq because Britain and America assisted him to be so. They then gave him all the weapons and encouragement that he needed and encouraged their satrapies in the Gulf to give him money to attack Iran. And 1 million people died in the Iran-Iraq war. And he was doing it for us. And then we say we're going to pulverize and kill 1 million Iraqis to punish him for his role in, amongst other things, the Iran war. It's just sick hypocrisy.
So do you think intervention is always wrong? What if it was done through the United Nations? So let's say Britain and America would have got that second resolution and it would have been passed unanimously. Would that then, in your eyes, be more legitimate, or is all intervention?
No, I think I'm not against all intervention. As a matter of fact, if I'd been alive at the time of the Spanish Civil War, when fascism overthrew successfully the elected progressive government in Spain, if I'd been alive and old enough at the time, I would have been fighting in Spain as part of the International Brigade and its intervention. I think the Vietnamese were right to intervene in Cambodia and overthrow Pol Pot and his genocidal, insane regime. There is a case for intervention, but it has to satisfy 3 criteria. First of all, it has to be legal. That means it has to be authorized by properly empowered organs like the United Nations Security Council. That's a necessary but not sufficient condition. The second condition is that it must not make things worse. So the intervention in Afghanistan, for example, has made everything worse in my view. And thirdly, it should, if humanly possible, be regional. So it was right that it was Vietnam that dealt with the Pol Pot problem next door. It would be right for the neighboring countries of the Congo to try to solve the problems that exist there, or in Mali for that matter. What can never be right is the former colonial powers returning to the scenes of their former crimes as empires and reoccupying those countries, which is what has happened in Mali just in the last couple of days. That can never be right. So it must be legal, it must do less harm than the situation it's supposed to deal with, and it should be regional. So African problems should be dealt with by Africans. They should never be dealt with by white men re-invading places that they used to snatch slaves from and sail them in the holds of boats across to the Americas and make them work as slaves in the fields. That can never be right.
So with Afghanistan, that you say that military intervention was wrong. After September the 11th, then, in your view, what would have been the best possible outcome for that?
Yeah.
And how should Britain and, more importantly, America have behaved?
Well, I'm glad you reminded me of that, because that's one of the other points I was going to make in relation to your earlier question. I said in the House, you remember, I got an award for the Debater of the Year for this speech. I said this 3 days after 9/11. Don't try and hang bin Laden against me. I was the last man standing opposing bin Laden when you, the Tories, were giving him, not you.
Not you specifically.
No, not you. Although they're in the dear seats, yeah. when Britain and America sent bin Laden to Afghanistan, I said to Mrs. Thatcher, to her face, on the floor of the House of Commons, you have opened the gates to the barbarians, and a long dark night will now descend on the people of Afghanistan. That's what I said 2 days before the triumph of bin Laden and his ilk in Kabul in 1989. So, bin Laden's nothing to do with me, right?
I don't think you're under any suspicion, George.
No, well, you never know. The point is this. We sent bin Laden to Afghanistan. Now we're punishing the people of Afghanistan for having once had bin Laden in their country. If the point of the Afghan war was to get rid of Al-Qaeda, well, we've got rid of them all right. We've sent them first into Libya and now into Syria. We're employing them again. There's no Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, as the United States government openly acknowledges. If it was about bin Laden's dead. So why are young British soldiers, like one that was acknowledged at Prime Minister's Question Time today, still being asked to give their life's blood for a war, the aims of which, if they were as stated, have already been achieved? That's why I say we really have to get out of Afghanistan without any further delay. We don't have the blood to spare, and we certainly don't have the treasure to spare. What should have been done?
Yeah.
We should have made a forensic, police-style attack on the Tora Bora and captured bin Laden. Instead, we made war against the entire country of Afghanistan, and we occupied it year after year, installing a puppet government. Let me tell you what I said at Brentwood, Jack Straw's alma mater, just 2 days ago. Jack Straw, in January of 2002, addressing the House, said, I expect that our soldiers will be home for Christmas. You'd think politicians wary of the First World War.
But he didn't say what year.
Yeah. He said, we'll be home for Christmas. And I rose and said, the troops will not be home 10 Christmases hence. And it says in Hansard, brackets, laughter. That's what it says. He invited the House to laugh at this idea and how they laughed. But 10 Christmases hence, we are still in Afghanistan. And nobody can rationally explain why we're still there. Because we're going to leave on exactly the terms that we could have left at any time in the past 10 years.
One thing that fascinates me about you, George, is I think a lot of people presume your opinions on things and they turn out to be wrong. It was one thing I learned at talkSPORT was that a lot of people presume that actually you might have a lot of truck with conspiracy theories, particularly things around 7/7 and 9/11. I remember hearing you deal with one particular caller on 9/11. I mean, in terms of going that far, that George Bush might have been behind 9/11 or that Tony Blair might have known about 7/7, I mean...
Ludicrous. Ludicrous. In my experience in life, which is now quite long, almost everything is a cock-up rather than a conspiracy. You know, in a straight kind of way, I mean. You know, our rulers are not James Bonds. They're more Austin Powers.
Austin devolved powers these days.
Devolved powers, well said, very good. Very good. All sorts of things happen because people don't know or they forgot. Like the senior Labour figure that asked me today, what were the reasons you left the Labour Party again for? They have no historical memory, they make mistakes, they fail to learn from history, and so on. I don't believe for 1 second that the Americans committed that atrocity against themselves on 9/11. Still less do I believe that the British committed the atrocity on 7/7 against themselves, except in this respect. Both governments appear to believe that both of these atrocities, mass murder, came out of a clear blue sky. And I argued, then and now, that actually these things came out of a swamp. They came out of a swamp of hatred and bitterness, which we ourselves helped to sow. So, in that regard, we are not directly, of course, responsible for these acts of mass murder. The mass murderers are directly responsible for it. But we created the conditions for these mass murderers to prosper. I said in that speech right after 9/11, if we handle this the wrong way, we'll make 10,000 bin Ladens. Well, actually, we probably made 10 million bin Ladens, including in our own country. And they exploded themselves and many of us on 7/7.
It's an argument, obviously, you famously had many times with Christopher Hitchens, and I'm not sure if anyone in the room has seen the YouTube footage of those incredible debates, and it really was, no matter what side of the debate you were on, phenomenal to see, almost politics done as a boxing match. Yeah. And there was clearly a lot of, it looked like personal animosity between the pair of you. Yeah. Was there any mutual respect?
I had no respect for him, and I doubt if he had any for me, although I did start that speech by saying, you wrote like an angel, but you are now in the service of the devil. And that's what I believe happened to Christopher Hitchens. He was a great man of the left, and when he was a magnificent asset. But he just became a magnificent ass when he went over to the Bushites. And he even in that debate defended Bush's handling of New Orleans, of the floods in New Orleans. And now even Bush wouldn't defend his handling of the New Orleans flooding disaster. But Hitchens felt the need to. But I'll grant you this. 2 British guys in New York had thousands of people literally queuing many, many blocks and paying top dollar to hear 2 British guys have a brawl, have a verbal brawl. And the YouTube video has phenomenal hits, millions and millions.
He obviously sadly died yesterday. You won't be surprised to hear that Hitchens is an idol of mine, and I find his writing electric, even when I disagree with him. And I was sad that he died. Any death, of course, is a tragedy. A million is a statistic, as Stalin said. But do you miss him?
No, I can't. I'm not glad that he's dead, because my religion forbids me to take pleasure in anyone's death. But I don't give him a moment's thought unless asked by people like you. I described him famously, as it turned out, it's in all the anthologies, as a drink-soaked former Trotskyist popinjay. And I think that's more or less what he was.
Another one of your famous YouTube clips is obviously the showdown with the Senate, which is, to this day, just an incredible piece of political drama. What I think amazes me more than anything else is that they clearly didn't know what they were letting themselves in for. I mean, it was just ridiculous. Even if they'd have spoken to Tony Blair, and I'm sure there are some people that think the British government colluded in it, but they would have obviously said, this guy's a serious debater, he will open up gaps in your argument. I found it remarkable that they didn't think that putting you in front of TV. I mean, did you realise at the time that actually it was a massive platform for you?
I did. As George W. Bush might put it, they misunderestimated me. They misunderestimated, I think, also the quality of debate and so on in British politics compared to theirs. I mean, most of these senators would be lucky to be a town councillor in England. And yet they are, well, look at George W. Bush. I watched Fahrenheit 9/11 again last night because my wife hadn't seen it. I wanted to show it to her. And I marveled again, how could this imbecile be the most powerful person in the world and elected twice, or stolen the election once at least, maybe both times. But these senators were kind of George Bush minus. Indeed, Norman Coleman, who's now an ex-senator, and I campaigned against him in Minnesota and had the pleasure of being the first foreigner to describe him as ex-Senator Norman Coleman, who was the chairman of the Senate panel. You know, I used to be a boxer, and there comes a moment in a fight where you can see in the other person's eyes that they no longer want to be there.
That was after about 5 minutes.
Well, I saw in just a few minutes into this, I saw in his eyes the feeling that this is actually not going well. Can we, metaphorically throw in the towel here? But of course, you can't do that when the live TV cameras are on from all over the world. No, I relished getting up close and personal with them. Well, they never asked me back, put it that way.
I remember the story at the time. I was at school. I remember it on the front page of the Telegraph. And what it was that apparently troops had gone into a bombed-out government building in Afghanistan and found in a shoebox evidence that somehow people had bought and sold oil on your behalf, which was clearly preposterous at the time.
Yeah, it was. I had.
But were you scared that actually you could indict yourself and that you might end up in prison?
Many people
was a genuine threat?
were afraid for me that I'd end up in Guantanamo Bay, but the Daily Telegraph paid me £2.3 million for having published those lies in libel damages and costs. So thanks very much for that. But the Senate was a different challenge because this could have ended disastrously. But I relished the opportunity. It was like a heaven-sent opportunity for me. And I didn't know how poor a set of opponents they'd be. But for me, it was getting a platform to tell the truth about the war and to tell the truth about what had happened in Iraq, as well as to ridicule the suggestion that I was a multi-millionaire. So I always put it this way: Saddam Hussein never gave me a cent, but the newspapers who alleged that he had have given me millions. Thanks very much.
Well, talking of platforms, I'm keen that if anyone has a burning question for George, I'm happy to take 2 or 3. If anyone does have a question they'd like to ask, please raise your hand and we will come to you. Yeah, what's your name, sir? Richard, and what's your question?
During a lot of the recent by-elections, there were reports of unattributed leaflets going out attacking like the religious credentials of some of the other candidates, with phrases like "God knows who is a true Muslim." Who is
That's not unattributed. That was me.
I was about to ask her.
Kind of invalidates your question, but go on. Yeah, my opponent was a Pakistani Muslim who was going around telling people they should vote for him because he was a Pakistani Muslim. So I felt it was absolutely fair in those circumstances to point out it's a funny kind of Muslim who's always down the Bull and Bush, downing 5 pints of Guinness a night. When I
sounds like a legend.
When I've never touched alcohol in my entire life, nor my father before me, nor my children after me, I thought that was a fair enough point to make. If you're going around saying people should vote for you because you're the Pakistani Muslim candidate, it's fair enough to point out that I'm actually a better Pakistani Muslim than you are.
Any other questions, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, is that up on the balcony, is it?
Yeah.
What's your name, mate?
My name's Andy. I'm a big fan of both your shows on talkSPORT. So don't get me wrong, George. I miss yours very much as well.
Thanks.
You referred to having made some mistakes, and I'd be interested if you wouldn't mind sharing perhaps what you think some of those have been over the years. Maybe during the Blair years, if there were any during those years.
Yeah, that's obviously a very fair question. Only a fool has no regrets. That's the first point to make, and I'm definitely not a fool. I've got loads of regrets. Most of them are personal, and it wouldn't profit me or anyone else involved to rehearse them. But I've made a number of political mistakes. First of all, on the interpersonal level, I could have been less aggressive. I could have put things differently. I could have chosen that word rather than that word. But when you speak and write millions of words, as I do, and as Matt now does in his radio work, it's easy to make mistakes that are there and nailed on the wall forever. I also made a mistake in believing for most of my life that public ownership of more or less everything was what we should strive for. I think that that's wrong. Anybody that's ever worn a suit made by a state tailor or eaten in a restaurant run by the state knows that some things are better run by private individuals and business rather than the state, and vice versa, by the way. But I had, for most of my life, the wrong mix in the mixed economy that I fight for. the wrong mix in my mind. And I was proselytizing for public ownership of things that actually is a mistake. The big questions...
Does that mean you've drifted right a little then?
Yeah, I think that socialism does not have to mean the state owning everything. You know, you and I both had a Labour card on which Clause 4, Part 4 of the party's constitution was inscribed to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry based on the public ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. Well, that was a promise to bring into public ownership the means of production, distribution and exchange, which means every factory, every shop, every bank and so on. The banks might have been a good idea because we ended up having to buy them anyway. But no, I think that I had too statist a view of what socialism meant, and I think that for a long time I misunderestimated the role of individuals within society and got the balance of state versus individual wrong. That's quite a big mistake to confess to, and I've just done it.
Well, it's to your credit, George, indeed. I'll take one more from the audience. If you are up on the balcony, you've got one. Can you just shout out? Oh, okay, one down here. What's your name?
Chris.
Hi, Chris.
I feel I agree with pulling out of Afghanistan. I studied warfare at university and was looking at the time to see what was happening. And I do feel pull out is necessary. However, is there an argument to be made for if you kick the door down, you have a responsibility to leave the place in a better state?
No, because you wouldn't take that view if your own house, God forbid, were broken into tonight and completely trashed. You wouldn't say to the criminal, "Why don't you just stick around for a while?" And it's not truer if you're a country. Afghanistan was as it happens, I know quite a lot about Afghanistan because I was a supporter of the man that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda hanged from a lamppost and cut his penis off and stuck it in his mouth, having snatched him from a United Nations compound, President Najibullah. So I've studied Afghanistan for a very long time. And I could have told them, or any schoolboy history book could have told them, that nobody has successfully occupied Afghanistan, not even Alexander the Great. And David Cameron ain't no Alexander the Great. That's the truth of it. It cannot work. I was at a meeting once in Glasgow, and an Afghan stood up at the meeting and said, "We Afghans are a peace-loving people." And everybody in the room laughed because they're not a peace-loving people. Actually, they love fighting. And they're really, really, really good at fighting. And moreover, they're fighting for their country. They regard it as their sacred duty to drive foreigners who've come to occupy them off their land, whilst our people are not. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not a pacifist. I'm the least pacifist person you can meet. If somebody invaded and occupied us, I'd be one of those creeping up behind them to cut their throats on the street corners as they stood guard. I would fight to the death to defend this country, my family, the people amongst whom I live. But if you go to somebody else's country and occupy it, you've got to expect that they're going to fight you back. And this seems to me a fundamental weakness in the British psyche, in the political class and in the media. They seem to think that Johnny Foreigner likes it up him and he's just going to take it. And in fact, he might even throw flowers at you as you come to do it. And that's just not true. And the ease with which, the gusto with which we enter or threaten to enter one foreign adventure after another seems to me to imply that no real lessons have been learned. What are we waiting for? Are we waiting for some great military disaster? Instead of our soldiers dying in 1, 2s and 3s, are we waiting for 300 to die in one big bomb? Are we waiting for these 2 Hercules that were shuttling French forces into Mali? Are we waiting for them both to be shot down and everybody on board to perish? Is that what it will take? Because frankly, it's only a matter of time before that kind of level of military disaster occurs. And one of the greatest canards is that people like me are against our soldiers. It's the opposite. It's because we're not against our soldiers that we want them home here with their families and defending our own country rather than attacking and invading other people's.
George, we've reached the end now. The only thing that remains to do is, what we're going to do is each guest will provide the first question for the next. So my next guest is going to be Nigel Farage. In a month's time. I wonder if you could provide me, George, with the first question I should ask him.
Well, I better leave the 3 o'clock in the afternoon thing. Do you need to be a white, slightly red-faced, Union Jack waistcoated Englishman shouting boo at Johnny Foreigner at the Channel Ports to support UKIP? Because that... Did you get that? Write that down. Write that down. No. Shouting boo at Johnny Foreigner along the White Cliffs of Dover does not constitute a future for Britain. And that, to me, is what UKIP is. It's a group of little Englanders shouting abuse at anything foreign. Me, I quite like foreign. And I mean near foreign as well as far foreign. I like Italian suits and Italian food. And I think that the French do a lot of things really better than us. That's intriguing, isn't it?
Phenomenal. George, it's been a real pleasure. I can't thank you enough for doing
Thanks
that.
so much.
Thank you very much.
Here's a star, man. Star.
George, go on. Folks, before we let you leave, we should just, I should thank you all, really. I can't thank you enough, all of you individually, for coming down. I wanted to put on a night that was exciting, that shared my passion for politics and got great politicians to come down and explain why they got into politics and to be able to answer any question that I or the audience would put to them. It's been a thrilling night for me just to sit and watch at times, George. So thank you all for coming down. Next month we've got Nigel Farage. That's on Wednesday the 13th. We should also thank as well the people here at the venue, the St James Theatre, who've been so hospitable, and everyone at Avalon who made this possible. But before we go, please give it up one more time for the legend, Mr. George Galloway.
Thank you
very much. Cheers.